Let us see what are these productive forces. The existence of any particular system of economic relations is explained in terms of the level of development of the productive forces. These forces consist of labor power and accumulated knowledge. As man's mastery over nature increases, the productive forces will inevitably develop. At each level of development, the particular system of economic relations will be most suited to contain and facilitate their operation. Thus, the existence of any given economic system in terms of its suitability to the productive forces which were they at a different stage of development would either not require or else actively destroy it. Superstructure and false consciousness. Upon the system of economic relations rises the superstructure of legal and political institutions. These serve to consolidate and protect the economic base and are therefore similarly explicable in terms of their sustaining and protective function. Finally, the political institutions generate their own peculiar ideology. This is the system of beliefs, perceptions, values and prejudices which together consolidate the entire structure and serve both to conceal the changeability and to dignify the actuality of each particular arrangement. This is what collectively called the false consciousness. Dialectics of history. Within the framework set so far, Marx envisages as the fundamental source of social change to be transformations of economic relations which themselves result from the development of productive forces. The major economic arrangements that Marx discusses are primitive communism, slavery, feudalism and capitalism. Labor is portrayed as the human essence and the driving force of history for its evolution through these systems towards the culmination in communism. It is labor which appears in the fictive forms of market value, and it is labor which can be alienated from and restored to itself, determining thereby the happiness and misery of mankind. In primitive societies, property was held in common. People were not alienated from their labor, but at the same time human productive forces were too poorly developed. The growth of the forces of production led to feudal system of society, in which the serf who was subordinate to the feudal lord had to work on the lord's land rather than on his own land. The vastly greater development of productive forces that took place under the Industrial Revolution resulted in capitalism. And it is under capitalism that labor, which is the human essence for Marx, is abused in the worst way. Marx took over from the political economist David Ricardo the so-called labor theory of value. This explains the exchange value of a commodity in terms of the socially necessary hours of labor required to produce or reproduce it. According to Marx, objectified labor is the predetermined amount for which the capitalist pays. For instance, the workers labor for 12 hours. This is labor as a commodity. The exchange value of this commodity is the amount needed to produce it. That is, the amount needed to keep the worker alive and reproductive. But there is a dual nature to the exchange of labor and capital. The capitalist obtains the worker's labor power for the prescribed period, say 1 day, and can use this labor power to produce as much wealth as he is able to get out of it. This is what Marx means when he says that capital buys living labor. The worker gets a fixed sum regardless of what the capitalist can make out of his labor power. Thus, by exchanging his means of subsistence, which serves to produce his labor power and is therefore the true price of labor for hours of labor in excess of those needed to produce those means, living labor is extorted from the worker. This, according to Marx, leads to the accumulation of surplus. Marx thus portrays a theory of exploitation. He postulates that the production of surplus value must necessarily proceed through the extraction of hours of unpaid labor. Hence, capitalistic relations are necessarily exploitative. Thus, Marx's critique of capitalism comes to rest on an ingenious and scientifically phrased theory of exploitation. This theory only tangentially makes contact with observations as to how the state of man under capitalism is experienced, but it makes explicit how the resultant false consciousness is worst among all the vicissitudes it has seen over the course of history. In the capitalist society, false consciousness may not be a form of unhappiness, but its evil lies in the fact that it inevitably endorses exploitation through its inability to perceive the exploitation that is there. The forced labor of the serf for the feudal lord still exists as the forced labor of the worker for the capitalist. The difference is that under feudalism, the nature and extent of the forced labor is apparent, whereas under capitalism, the nature and extent of the coercion is disguised. Workers appear to be free laborers, voluntarily making agreements with the capitalists. In fact, the position of workers as a class in relation to the capitalists as a class means that they are not free. They must take the terms that the capitalists offer them or starve, and capitalists will only employ them under terms which allow surplus value to be extracted from their labor. This is not because capitalists are cruel or greedy, though some may be, but because of the economic laws inherent in capitalist production, which through free competition coerce individual capitalists as much as individual workers. Though equally coerced, capitalists suffer less from this coercion than workers. Now, labor, which is portrayed as the substance of exploitation in the capitalist economy, is for Marx also the driving force of history. Therefore, this system cannot continue as such forever. It should pave way to negation of the negation. The state, together with all its apparatus and the false consciousness which surrounds it, will finally wither away. This state of communism is inevitable simply because productive forces are bound to develop beyond the point where capitalism could contain them. Having developed to that point, the fetter of capitalism will be broken asunder, and communism, which is the only economic arrangement suitable to the enormous levels of development which will by then have been achieved, must necessarily come in place of it. Towards the end of first volume of Capital, Marx sketches how the laws of capitalism will bring about the destruction of capitalism. On the one hand, competition between capitalists will lead to an ever diminishing number of monopoly capitalists. On the other hand, the misery, oppression, slavery, degradation and exploitation of the working class grows. But working class is, because of the nature of capitalist production, more numerous and better organized. Eventually, they will unleash their power. The ensuing revolution will overthrow capitalism, but that will not mean a return to private property in the old sense, but to property based on the gains made under capitalism. That is, on cooperation and common possession of land and the means of production. Capitalism will make this transition relatively easy, since it has already expropriated all private property into its own hands. All that is now necessary is for the masses of the people expropriate these few expropriators. This transition, however, will be impossible without a violent revolution, such as had supposedly attended the transition from feudalism to bourgeois mercantilism in 18th century France.